All right. Hello, everybody. It's Mr. Longacre, and we're going through Notes B on Unit 5, talking about the Mexican Cession and the Compromise of 1850 are going to be our major topics today. So we take a little break from the movements of abolitionism and the women's rights movements and temperance and things like that to take a look maybe at the broader picture of the political scene that was going on in the 1850s. Now, you remember from our previous unit that where we left off in terms of the big picture United States was that we have just won the Mexican-American War and attained the southwestern section of the United States. Everything you see here in the orangish, yellowish color. It's about 25 million acres. It's almost the same size as Louisiana Purchase, and we purchased it for $15 million. So we basically got all of this territory for a total of 30 million. It's pretty amazing land acquisition price there. But ultimately, the Mexican Cession territory, again, this orange piece, is going to be a much bigger problem than what we had ever intended. It included Texas, it included New Mexico, Utah, and California. And really, a lot of people felt like the Mexican-American War was the fulfillment of that old manifest destiny idea, the idea that God wanted us to expand out to the Pacific Ocean and take as much land as we were. And man, did we ever take some land. So the Southerners, in this case, they were excited about it. They felt like their military service in the war was going to allow them to open up that territory to slavery. Remember, places like Tennessee and some southern states sent many volunteers out to help Texas during the initial rebellion against the Mexican government. And then the anti-slavery Northerners, they were very worried about it because they felt like this could be a chance for the Southern institution of slavery to expand beyond its original intent and scope and really maintain that slaveocracy is what they were calling it. And so Mexico, was scary. The Southerners felt like they should have it. A lot of Northerners are going to point to the old Missouri Compromise line. You can see that here in this picture, this red line, what we call the 3630 line. And that was supposed to be the line that said everything above was a free state and everything below was a slave state. Now, that line was obviously created for the Louisiana Purchase territory. It never intended, or at least it never had accounted for, what would happen when we took all of that land in the Southwest near and around Mexico. And so there's obviously a big political disagreement. Does the Compromise of 1820 still apply, or do we have to revisit and rewrite some of those laws? And so Mexico was on the mind of everybody. The Mexican Cession is what it's called, was very controversial. On the left there, you have a very famous author, Ralph Waldo Emerson. He said, Mexico will poison us. John C. Calhoun on the right, you probably remember him, he said, Mexico to us is the forbidden fruit. The penalty of eating it would be to subject our institutions to political death. And if you're thinking about what is coming, really what Calhoun is warning us about is war. And as a senator from the first state to secede from the Union, he probably has a really good perspective on that. Now, in 1848, once the war was over, we did have a political election. James K. Polk, our president from 44 to 48, did not seek re-election. He gave it to this guy, Lewis Cass. He was a war general of sorts, but what you really want to know about Cass and about the Democratic Party as a whole is that in order to accommodate some of their northern supporters, the Democrats really created an idea, and they took it from Stephen A. Douglas, but they created an idea known as popular sovereignty. I'm going to highlight that down here. This popular sovereignty idea. You probably want to make a note of that in your notes. And popular sovereignty was an interesting idea, but it basically boiled down to that they believed that the people in the territories should decide if they were going to be a slave state or not. So no longer would they put a line on the map and say, free above and slave below, but they would put they would allow the people who moved into the territory to decide what they want to be. So it was a pretty novel idea. And on the other side, the Whigs, again, we're talking Whigs and Democrats here, the Whigs nominated Zachary Taylor. You might recognize him from his role in the Mexican-American War. He was the general that led the troops down to the Rio Grande River, which resulted in that little battle that started the entire war. Taylor was a slave owner, and so a lot of people knew already what his stance was concerning slavery. But that left a lot of the anti-slavery voters in the North, these abolitionists in particular, your William Lloyd Garrisons, your Harriet Beecher Stowe, to really begin to think carefully about, who do I want to support? Well, if the Democratic Party is going to go with popular sovereignty, that's going to essentially turn Texas into a Southern territory. If I go with Zachary Taylor of the Whig Party, well, he's already a slave owner, so he'll probably turn that into slave territory. And so the Northerners didn't really know how to feel, and they decided to form their own party, a third party here, called the Free Soil Party. And as you might imagine, it was based solely on the idea that if elected, the Free Soil Party would ban slavery, or keep slavery at least from expanding throughout the continental U.S. So when it came down to it, you had the Democrats and Lewis Cass on the left. You had the Free Soil Party, who were actually led by Martin Van Buren, which is kind of a funny turn of events. And together, those two parties really are going to kind of detract from one another. They're going to take away from each other. And it's going to lead to Zachary Taylor and the Whigs winning the election there on the right-hand side. So I put that old log cabin symbol there next to Zachary Taylor to remind you that, that's where the Whig Party really got its firm footing, was appealing to the common man during the Jacksonian era. And you can see the electoral map here. The Democrats are going to win a lot of the Midwestern territories, we would call it. But the Whigs, kind of being a sectional party and having some Southern supporters, having some Northern supporters, they're eventually going to win the entire election. So, that's all great and important. It's just to show you that this idea of slavery is becoming a paramount issue. It is becoming the number one issue, and it is going to come to a head here very soon. So regardless of that debate that was going on back in Congress, the one good thing that you can't deny that came out of the Mexican session, I should say, was the fact that in 1848, a few pioneers who had moved out to the California territory found some specks of gold in a river out there. And over the next year, thousands of Americans are going to make the trek out to California to try to get rich quick in one of these gold fields. Now, the river that they found the gold in was called the American River. It was named the American River. And you can see here that there was a significant gold field there. But not many people realized that, and they would settle along a lot of these other rivers. Some people set it out in San Francisco, and people would sift and go through the river, and some would find gold, most would not. But what happened was that there were so many people that moved out to California in 1849, they called themselves 49ers, that almost within a year, California had enough people to apply to Congress to become a state, right? So you have to first have a certain amount of population to have the ability to become a state. And by 1849, California did that. So not surprisingly, California applied to Congress to become a state, and they applied as a free state. Now, that might sound pretty straightforward, but you got to remember that California, when it comes to the 3630 line, is actually split in half. So I'm going to take my pointer here and just point out this would be the 3630 line, this top line of the New Mexico, Arizona. And if I followed that across, you can see it would cut California in half. So what to do with California, right? Is it going to become a free state? Is it going to become a slave state? And how is that going to upset the balance in our Congress and in our Senate in particular? Now, Southerners, they felt like their military service should open up all that territory to slavery. They actually thought it was a travesty, a misrepresentation to not make California a slave state, and they weren't happy about it. We also have the problem with the Missouri Compromise. Should that 3630 line be followed? Should that 3630 line be eliminated because it was an old policy? And, you have Northerners in the Free Soil, you have Northerners in the Whigs, you have Southerners in the Whigs, Southerners in the Democrat, and you really got a big problem here. I mean, California is such a huge state, and still today, I mean, there's so many large cities and so many people that live within that state that we wanted to add it, but how and what to do with it became a serious problem. You add on the fact that in the Senate, we currently had 15 slave states and 15 free states. which meant we had equal senators, and that was an advantage that the Southerners really liked. And we've got a problem, and I kind of gave it away there by going to the next slide, but anytime America, it seems like in the early 1800s, has a problem and needs somebody to find a compromise, in comes the great compromiser one last time, Henry Clay. And you can see from the picture here on the left that Henry Clay at this point in his life is very old. In fact, he's going to die by 1851, so he's in his final years. And Henry Clay is going to come in, and as a Whig leader, who ran many times and lost, he is going to be the one who comes up with the complex compromise. So here it is. Okay, this is going to be Henry Clay's final act. He wrote the Compromise of 1820, he wrote the Compromise of 1832, and now he's going to write the Compromise of 1850. And really what the Compromise of 1850 comes down to are 5 different things, okay? And you got to know all of them. You want to make notes about them as you go along. But first and foremost, California was accepted as a free state. Done. No popular sovereignty, no, letting the people there choose. They were going to be a free state, okay? That's number 1. Number 2, for the rest of the Mexican territory that we had gotten, Utah and New Mexico, they were going to be decided by popular sovereignty. Okay, so that was where the residents of a territory vote to determine policy. So no matter how much we split these areas up, it was going to be popular sovereignty that got to decide that. So people who moved there were going to vote on whether or not they wanted to be free or slave. Third, and this one's kind of insignificant in the grand scheme of things, a little border dispute was settled in favor of New Mexico, basically gave New Mexico more land and paid Texas for the land. So that one's kind of insignificant, I'll be honest. Fourth, this is interesting, slavery was allowed to continue in D.C., but the slave trade was abolished. So you would no longer see this scene here where you have slaves up on a trading block and trading them to the highest bidder, but slavery as a whole would still be allowed. And then finally, the major concession to the South was the passage of a much more harsh and stringent fugitive slave law. And basically, this Fugitive Slave Act is going to give Southerners considerable power to enter northern free states and capture their runaway slaves. Okay, so let's just quick review that. Number 1, think to yourself, was this a northern or a southern advantage? Okay, California being a free state. All right, hopefully you came to that would be a northern advantage. Letter B, popular sovereignty. Now this one's a little trickier. Is that a northern or a southern advantage? You got to look at it. Well, here's the old 3630 line, and you can see that 3630 line essentially splits it north and south. So maybe we call that one a push. Maybe we say that doesn't favor one or the other. 3, we're going to ignore for now. 4, slavery was allowed to continue, but the slave trade was abolished. I think that would be a northern advantage because that's taking something away from slavery. And then the final one is this fugitive slave law, which would be a southern advantage. So if we counted that up, it would be 2 for the north, 1 for the south, and then maybe 2 pushes. And you're starting to see, again, these themes of things always favoring the northern states. Now, if we look at the one thing that the South did get, the fugitive slave law, it's important to understand exactly what that meant. Because under the fugitive slave law, blacks were not given the right to testify on their own behalf. They were denied a jury trial. So if someone went from the South and went up to the North and captured them, the fugitive slave would not have any say or any ability to fight that. In addition, Northerners that helped runaways would face federal prosecution. They could be thrown in jail for it. And not only that, but Northerners could be deputized at any moment to be forced to help the Southerners catch their runaway slaves. So this is just a huge, slap in the face here to Northerners who are probably at this point forming into abolitionists, who are now being told by the federal government that you have to help Southerners maintain slavery. William Lloyd Garrison, you can imagine how he felt about this. He hated it. He said, we execrate it, we spit upon it, we trample it under our feet. This is the guy who's going to burn the copy of the Constitution here in 4 years. It was awful. Northerners felt that they were being forced to do something. Southerners who expected this law to be followed and went into the North oftentimes found the Northern abolitionists were not willing to help, and so they felt betrayed by the Northern defiance. And in the end, Henry Clay's last effort here is I think has good intentions, but much like most of the compromises, they're like putting band-aids on an open wound, folks. They are trying to maybe fix something that needs a fundamental change, right? Like if you have a gaping wound and you try to put a band-aid on it, will it help? Sure, maybe. But what you really need are stitches because you have to close that wound. And I use that analogy there because I think that's what's happening here. The United States is ripping farther and farther apart. And what we needed was to address the system of slavery as a whole. What we keep getting, though, are little patches, little band-aids on top of this. And so, yes, Henry Clay's compromise is going to work a little bit, but in the end, we're going to be at war within 10 years of the compromise. So it obviously doesn't have a lasting impact. And his party, his Whig party that he created, that is going to implode as a result. And we won't really see the Whig party anymore. They're going to be mostly destroyed by the middle of the 1850s. And we're going to see a very, very different outcome throughout the 1850s as a whole. So hopefully you've been answering the questions as you've gone along. And that is all for Notes B.